That the old world is dying cannot be gainsaid. It's demonstrated every Saturday and every Sunday on the major streets of the major cities of the entire world. The population of all Western countries, everyone, including the United States, are demanding a ceasefire in the slaughter of the people in Gaza, overwhelmingly children and women being slaughtered in unprecedented numbers. But their governments are deaf, dumb, and blind to the protestations of their own public and apparently bereft themselves of a conscience. It is demonstrated in the current standing of those same Western governments in the face of their own electorates. No one can look at Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak, little Macron, little soldier Schultz, and bonkers Baerbock. No one can look at those and say these are popular leaders who truly speak for and represent their public. In fact, almost none of those I have mentioned, perhaps none of those that I have mentioned, could score even 25% of a poll in public, in elections. They're all going down. Little Ruta, the little Tony Blair monkey, has gone. The French electorate are just waiting to get their hands on little Macron. It's very unlikely that little soldier Schultz and bonkers Baerbock will even get to the starting post. The German government, a two-headed monster of the Greens and the so-called Social Democrats, can barely muster 30% in the opinion polls between them. And they are now exploring means by which they can outlaw their opposition. A process which is occurring now in all of the Western countries that I have mentioned. Joe Biden, unable to win a presidential election, seeks to put in prison his main opponent. Indeed, an opponent outstripping him in the public opinion polls just a year before the American presidential election. The fact that his main opponent is almost as bonkers as him, the fact that his main opponent has completely lost his moorings in the face of the atrocities taking place in Gaza is immaterial for my case. My case is that these Western countries are now so dysfunctional that they are seeking to imprison and or outlaw their opposition. In Britain, a very substantial effort has been made all week, thwarted only by the refusal of London's Metropolitan Police to go along with it, threatening to ban an entirely lawful demonstration of hundreds of thousands of people who have already begun setting out for London for what may be the biggest ever demonstration for Palestinian rights. The government concocted an entirely synthetic culture war, arguing that marching in a different part of London, hours and hours after the commemorations of the armistice at the end of the First World War, marching miles away hours later for an armistice was somehow an insult to the memory of the fallen in the First and Second World Wars. Not that the presence at these ceremonies of the main war criminals of the 21st century was not a desecration of the sacrifice of the fallen. The fact that Tony Blair, every single year, his face waxen with fake grief, his poppy ever larger, threatening to topple him over with its size and weight. These hypocrites who murder men and ask God to give thanks. This monstrosity of a collection of British warmongers at the head of the armistice celebrations or commemorations. That's not any kind of insult to the dead. But people marching for a ceasefire, for a settlement, peaceful, diplomatic, political settlement to a murderous conflict, that is, according to the British government. And they put up their oh so achingly anti-woke, anti-cancel culture libertarians to argue for the shredding of yet more British liberties. With a crown diamond encrusted, ermine rippling, and sapphires glowing, with a crown worth £3 billion on his head, the new British King Charles in Parliament this week solemnly intoned that his government was going to crack down further on social media platforms for the crime of disinformation. But of course, their problem is not with disinformation. Their problem is with information, which has broken the monopoly that they have held on the narratives that underpin their wars and many other aspects of their programs for government. The old world is dying also in the evidence before our eyes of the complete ineptitude and oftentimes complicity of the so-called opposition in their countries. Nowhere more lurid than in the United Kingdom itself, where the British government and the British opposition, so-called, form an ironclad consensus. An ironclad consensus for killing, for slaughter, both of them repeatedly refusing the pleas of their own party members, the pleas of their own constituents, the pleas of their own public for an end to the killing. The old world is dying in the brazen, lurid complicity of the so-called free press. Journalists, accomplices to murder. Journalists and broadcasters parroting the talking points of a foreign leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, who only a few weeks ago they were openly evincing their hope, their wish that he would be toppled by the mass demonstrations of people in Israel, calling him a chiseling crook who besmirches even the tawdry name of the Israeli parliament. The old world is dying on the economic front. Country after country disguising their slump into recession with various pieces of sophistry, smoke and mirrors, but all of them rotten from within, turning in and against each other in their own countries. A Dutch auction going on in Germany between the parties as to who can be the meanest to Johnny immigrant, Johnny refugee, who obviously is the reason for the parlous state of German politics and the German economy. It couldn't be their own government after all. It couldn't be the allies and friends of their own government after all that pushed Germany into economic and political suicide. The old world is dying, and it is very clear to all of us across all of these indices and many, many more. But I need to turn to the shortcomings of the New World. It's been oversold, including by me. It's been oversold, this tectonic shift in the balance of power in the world. The BRICS has been oversold. The rise of China and Russia and Iran have been oversold. They are able and have adjusted their narrative, their rhetoric, very significantly indeed. China in particular, what it's saying now about the massacres in Gaza are leagues away, leagues ahead of what they would have said Only 3 or 4 years ago, the last time, in fact, that this happened. But China is not able to decisively influence what's happening on the ground. It is not able to tell the United States that it must tell its client state that it arms and funds and shills and propagandizes for, vetoes for, in every international fora. China is not yet strong enough to be able to tell the United States, halt and desist. Russia, with its hands still full in the Ukraine, is certainly prepared to defend the sovereignty, territorial integrity of Syria, but it is not yet able to allow and facilitate Syria to take back its own sovereign territory that was stolen from it back in 1967 when the Beatles were top of the hit parade. The Golan Heights remains in the iron grip of Israeli occupation, and Russia is not able to do anything about that. Iran, which has, of course, a vastly enhanced military capability and will, if attacked, answer in kind, is not able to go on the offensive. That much is now clear. If it were, it would not have allowed 10,000 civilians in the Gaza Strip to be systematically slaughtered. 5,000 of them, counting those still under the rubble. 5,000 of those children, infants, and babies. If anybody in the world had been able to decisively intervene militarily, politically, economically, they would already have done so. And so we witness today a scene that will live in infamy, a scene redolent of the Nakba, the catastrophe in 1948, a scene redolent of the Second World War itself, a column of thousands, maybe tens of thousands of Palestinian refugees marching yet again into exile, refugees for the second time. The first time in 1948, the second time in 2023, headed from their homes, from the little patch of bitter earth called the Gaza Strip, to God knows where. Certainly not a home, certainly not safety. Everybody that Israel has sent from the north of Gaza into the south is equally at peril of being killed as they were in the north, but they have stampeded tens of thousands of human beings, marshaled by soldiers heavily armed. It was redolent to me of the people headed for the cattle trains and the death camps of Treblinka and of Auschwitz and of the killing fields of the European Nazi Holocaust against the Jews and against other subhumans as designated by the German Reich. Pages that will live in infamy have been fleeting past us like through the window of a train all of this week. Images of horror and macabre that most of us at least wish we had never seen. Images of small children with their head a cavity and no brain left within it. Images of twin babies being carried stone dead. Images of people tearing at the sheets, the shrouds covering their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters, their sons and their daughters, their husbands and their wives. People wailing, people rending their garments, people entirely helpless, being murdered like fish in a barrel, while the world remains either silent or cheering on those committing the massacres, supplying the weapons with which the massacres are being conducted, paying the money which the massacres require to fill the hole in the economy of Israel, which has fallen 13 billion in just 4 weeks. The old world is dying. The new world is struggling to be born, and thus we are living in the time of monsters. Some of them are big monsters. Some of them are small, small indeed. None smaller than the pitiful and pitiless guy on the make in number 10 Downing Street. A man who stabbed his mentor, his predecessor, Boris Johnson, in the back, only in order to return to take his place. A man whose wife is a billionaire, busily making profits, not just from the war in Gaza, but the war in Ukraine also. Billionaires with green cards, just biding their time before they head for the coast, Silicon Valley and the west coast of the United States of America. Now, I've got them all guessing in Britain as to what I personally am going to do next. But I've got them all asking me. The BBC today reporting on the resignation from the Labour front bench of the man I defeated in the Bradford West by-election, Mr. Imran Hussain, who became the first Labour front bencher to have the courage and the conscience to resign from Keir Starmer's front bench. The BBC report upon it concludes with the observation that none of his colleagues is free from the spectre of George Galloway and what he did to Imran Hussain when he defeated him spectacularly in the Bradford West by-election. The Financial Times, no less, asking me today for a comment on whether I was going to stand here or there. The Mail on Sunday, the Sunday Times. I've got them all guessing. Why? Because all of these media outlets know that millions of British people feel nothing but contempt for their governing party and their opposition party, and are desperately hoping, looking for some alternative that would free them from the prison of the uni party, the duopoly uni party, which is in power and opposition in Britain, and which is in power and opposition in the United States. There's going to be 3 top-line guests this evening on the mother of all talk shows, plus some of the best calls and messages you're going to find anywhere on the international media scene. Stay tuned. It's the mother of all talk shows.